Reprise de débat. L'honorable député de Sudbury.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, and it's my honor to once again rise and speak to this bill. But it was just over 1 month ago, Mr. Speaker, I stood in this House to speak to this bill, and in my speech, I warned the government that the biggest failure of this bill was, in fact, what is omitted, specifically a provision to ensure that banks were mandated to participate in the Ombudsman for Banking Services and Investments dispute resolution mechanism. And I know there's been a lot of talk on this side about their consumer protection plan. Avoiding this and ignoring this piece completely leaves consumers in the cold. I know they talk about their voluntary code, and they've done nothing to address the online or the e-commerce need for the voluntary code. And I know they talk about their credit card interest rates and what they've been doing on that. But you know what? Putting the font and making the font bigger on a bill does nothing to help the consumers. What it does, it lets them know how long it's going to take to pay it off. And they're doing nothing to actually support consumers with this. It's mind-boggling how they can say one thing, Mr. Speaker, and do another. But then 2 weeks ago today, Mr. Speaker, I participated in a Finance Committee hearing on this bill. Witnesses from both Option Consuméritaire and the Canadian Community Reinvestment Coalition echoed the testimony of Doug Melville, the Ombudsman and Chief Executive Officer of OBSI, that the economic regulatory system that Canadians rely on has been negatively affected by this government turning a blind eye to banks leaving the OBSI system. In his opening statement, Mr. Speaker, Jean-François Vinette from Option Consuméritaire said that the organization is, and I quote, highly preoccupied with what Mr. Douglas Melville mentioned earlier, that the banks not only chose but pay for the dispute resolution business that tries to resolve the complaints that consumers send against them. The lack of independence of such a structure and the conflict of interest between banks and the business hired to resolve disputes against them by consumers doesn't guarantee consumer protection in Canada and access to a neutral party. We're asking the government that all financial institutions that are federally regulated be obligated to offer OBSI for complaint resolution by consumers. That's our key message. We hope the government will understand this and that it is common sense. Unfortunately, sometimes, Mr. Speaker, we don't seem to have common sense coming from that side of the House. Tyler Somers from the Canadian Community Reinvestment Coalition recommended that the government ensure that all federally regulated banks are required to use the Ombudsman for banking services and investments to ensure consistency and independence in the resolution of customer complaints. And the government's response, Mr. Speaker, in what is meant to be a systemic review of legislation governing the banking system, the parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Finance complained that the witnesses were addressing issues that had been missed by the legislative review. Apparently, the government didn't want to hear how to further improve the banking system. It only wanted to hear witnesses tell the committee what a wonderful job it had done. The problem is, Mr. Speaker, that isn't true. Unfortunately, due to the government's decision to make this system review a technical bill with a very narrow scope, the government stopped parliamentarians from bringing forward the amendments required to make this bill the type of banking review that will help consumers, help small businesses, and help the economy as a whole. Today, business sections in some of Canada's top media outlets are reporting that the OBSI's Board of Directors has approved a scenario for winding down operations if the government continues to allow banks to opt out of their OBSI system. The board is worried that their credibility as an independent ombudsman is being undermined by banks leaving the OBSI system if they disagree with OBSI's decisions. The closure of OBSI's banking arm would be dreadful for consumers and for small businesses in this country, Mr. Speaker. The problem with allowing banks to choose their own firms to manage dispute resolution is that the banks become the firm's customers. And as the old adage goes, Mr. Speaker, for any business to thrive, the customer is always right. How can consumers trust any decision made by a private firm when they know that the bank is the one writing the paychecks? As Mr. Melville very eloquently put it when he appeared before the committee, Mr. Speaker, a service hired by the bank and that consequently has the bank as a client creates the perception, if not the reality, of a loss of critical independence. The service will know who it is they need to please in order to keep the business, and it's not the individual making the complaint. It is a clear conflict of interest. The problem with the government not addressing the issue of the banks leaving OBSI is that this is entirely a problem of its own making. In Budget 2010, this government announced that the banks would be required to be a member of an approved third-party dispute resolution mechanism, but it did not explicitly state that it must be OBSI. As such, both RBC and TD took this as a carte blanche to pull out of the OBI system and move to a private dispute resolution system without the appropriate regulations, Mr. Speaker, or legislation being brought forward by the government. Both the banks and OBSI have been in regulatory limbo for the last 2 years. The government has had many suitable opportunities to bring forward the required changes, the most notably which is the financial review, which we are currently debating, Mr. Speaker. Now is the time, Mr. Speaker, for the government to own up to its mistake and make the OBSI participation mandatory. Customers at TD and RBC are already paying the price. These customers are being turned away from the new private dispute resolution provider. They are being told that their complaint is not within the firm's mandate. They are being discouraged from making their complaint, or their complaints are simply not properly followed up. If OBSI is to shut its doors to banking complaints, all bank customers in Canada will be subject to this level of misinformation and diversionary tactics in order to ensure the happiness of the private dispute resolution provider's customers. Guess who it is, Mr. Speaker? The banks. The irony, of course, is where do Canadians who have complaints with TD and RBC try to turn for help with bringing their concerns forward? To OBSI. I will be supporting this bill, unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, as it needs to be passed by April 20th in order to ensure to comply with the Bank Act and to ensure that we do not add increasing insecurity to the economic and financial markets within Canada. However, it is with a heavy heart that I will be supporting this bill, not because of what is in it, but because of what could have been, Mr. Speaker. This bill is truly a missed opportunity. In closing, I would like to repeat the words of Mr. Melville in his opening statement before the Finance Committee. Should banks be permitted to choose their own provider of dispute resolution, in essence to hire and pay for the organization that will judge and rule on their market conduct, I ask you this. If the banks were given the choice of being regulated by the Department of Finance or some private for-profit body of their own choosing, whom do you think they would choose? Very obvious, Mr. Speaker. The government has a role in ensuring the stability of the financial systems. And the only way to ensure the stability of the banking sector is by increasing consumer and small business confidence, which was shaken by the financial crisis. If consumers and small businesses do not believe that they have access to an impartial ombudsman, if they have a complaint with their bank, there will be no way to guarantee their confidence. The government needs to act now to ensure this is not the case. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I look forward to answering questions. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? L'honorable député de la Salle-et-Marne.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. J'aimerais remercier mon collègue de Sudbury pour son allocution et surtout pour sa passion à défendre justement les droits des consommateurs, la protection des consommateurs et également pour représenter de façon admirable ces commettants de Sudbury. J'aimerais lui poser la question à savoir quelles sont les conséquences pour les consommateurs au niveau de la protection du consommateur, le fait que qu'il n'y ait pas un organe indépendant comme celui qu'il a mentionné, l'Office de l'Ombudsman, et les conséquences que cela, qu'on n'ait pas un organe indépendant des banques quand on a des plaintes par rapport à celles-ci.
The honourable member for Sudbury.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for her question and, of course, all of her great work that we do together on the Industry Committee and many other places. And I know we've spoken and we've discussed recently e-commerce and mobile payments and how the voluntary code isn't reaching into those areas yet. And, you know, when we're talking about OBSI, here's an organization that was created 15 years ago approximately at the request of the government of the day because the industry at that time wasn't protecting consumers and small businesses, and the consumers and small businesses had nowhere to go when they had a complaint. So they created this great organization. It's in place, and now, because this government has chosen not to act, not to put the legislation in place to keep these guys around, they're going to disappear. This isn't about, I've lost $50 in my bank account. Where can I find this $50? This is about when a mistake was made on a mortgage. This was made when a mistake was made in retirement savings, and what we can see happen on the far end of the spectrum is people losing their homes and losing their retirement savings because they're choosing not to act. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Bonavista Gander, Grand Falls, Windsor.
Just very quickly, talks about the OBSI, but in this case, what about the role of the FCAC as well? Wouldn't that be beneficial for many of the multiple providers to the system?
Honourable member for Sudbury.
Well, of course, the FCAC provides a very positive role to consumers and to the banking institutions. But when we're talking specifically, through you, Mr. Speaker, about protecting small businesses consumers and giving them an avenue to ensure that they're not being taken, and I use taken, by the banks, they provide those necessary rules and regulations. FCAC provides, they're looking at competition. They're making sure that there's fair competition in the market. But, you know, a mistake being made by the bank has nothing to do with the competition aspect. It has, I need resolution when a bank makes a mistake. And the average citizen, the average small business, the average consumers doesn't have the deep pockets to take on TD or RBC or any one of the large financial institutions. And so what the consumers need to be able to have is an organization to be able to have those pockets to challenge these guys in court if need be and to make sure there's some fair resolution. That's what OBSI does. That's why this government is dropping the ball in protecting consumers. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question and commentaire. L'honorable député de Pontiac.
Well, I too congratulate my honourable colleague on all the work he's done to protect consumers in this country. Well done. I have a particular concern as a New Democrat. I have issues with concentration of power when we're dealing with too high of a concentration of power. And financial institutions are now subject, according to this bill, to ministerial approval rather than approval of the superintendent of financial institutions. So I wonder if these decisions risk to be made on a partisan matter instead of being without political interference.
Honourable member for Sudbury.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to once again thank my honourable colleague from Pontiac for his question and his involvement on this file. I know we've talked about things that we can do to help his constituents and other issues in the past relating to consumer protection. The overall concern, you know, if we're using OBSI as an example, and that's what I've been talking about quite a bit because of the serious ramifications that could result from this government's inaction on this file, to start to see more control being taken away from nonpartisan, independent organizations right across the country is worrisome, is truly worrisome. Because at the end of the day, we want to ensure that there's fair, independent resolution for consumers and small businesses. I don't know if we'll see that when we start involving partisan decisions. So we need to ensure we're bringing forward organizations and supporting organizations like OBSI. Thank you.